My father called my military medals fake at my wedding and tried to rip them off in front of 50 guests. Then my husband said 6 words that left him crumpled on the reception floor. On a day meant for joy, a single moment of violence ignited a public revelation, leaving 50 guests stunned and a father on the floor, brought down by 6 quiet words. The small earring tumbled. I recall that distinct detail with the piercing clarity that marks moments when your entire being decides to capture every single second. The delicate gold hoop, a thoughtful gift from Kaylin's mother, Evelyn, which I wore because she had asked and because I cherished her for asking, struck the polished wooden floor of the reception hall. It bounced twice, then settled near a chair leg. My cheek was still processing what had just occurred. Not yet pain. That followed a fraction of a second later, as pain often does when impact is sudden. First, there was only the sharp crack, the jarring sensation of my head whipping sideways, and an immediate ringing in my ears. Then, the room came into focus. 50 people. Every single one of them staring at my father. I slowly turned back. Victor Thorne stood a mere 3 feet away, clad in the dress shirt my mother had chosen for this very occasion. His hand remained suspended in the air, exactly where it had been before he'd lashed out. His face had flushed the specific shade of red that signifies immediate post-action realization, rather than escalating rage. It wasn't the redness of building anger, but rather the stark color of someone who has just committed an act and is only now beginning to grasp its consequences. His hand began to rise once more. It never completed its ascent. Kaylin's hand closed around my father's wrist with the quiet certainty of someone who has dedicated years to precise movements in situations where others falter. No raised voice, no hint of a threat, no grand display of authority, just the controlled, professional grip of a man who has spent a career making critical decisions within incredibly tight time frames, and who, in this moment, knew precisely what was required. "Victor," Kaylin said. Just one word. Spoken softly enough that only the 3 of us, and perhaps the half-dozen people closest, heard it clearly. My father attempted to pull his arm free. Kaylin didn't tighten his grip, he simply maintained it. The distinction was crucial. Tightening would have been an act of force. Maintaining was simply a statement of fact. The arm was not going to complete its motion. The silence that enveloped that reception hall had a density I've never encountered before or since. 50 individuals collectively holding something that wasn't quite their breath, but its closest equivalent. It was the suspended state of witnesses who understand that what they are watching is profoundly real, and that its outcome will carry significant weight. Then, Kaylin looked directly into my father's eyes and uttered 6 words. She saved 12 men that day. Nothing more, nothing less. My father's face did something I had never witnessed in my 32 years. The anger drained from it. Not gradually, not in stages, but like water emptying from a glass tilted beyond its capacity. His eyes widened, his mouth parted slightly, and then something shifted behind his expression, not embarrassment, not shame. It was fear, coupled with a chilling recognition. He understood exactly what those words implied. The color vanished from his face as completely and visibly as a receding tide. His knees buckled. He swayed once, then twice, before collapsing to the floor. Let me rewind to the beginning, because this story makes no sense without understanding its origins. And it's in that beginning where you'll find the thread that ties everything together. My name is Alara Thorne. I'm 34 years old. I served 11 years as an Army helicopter pilot, primarily flying UH-60 Blackhawks. I earned my qualifications through a rigorous process that permitted no shortcuts, was impervious to family connections or personal charm, and responded solely to demonstrated competence in the air. I completed multiple deployments. I was decorated through official military channels. And for 32 years, I was also the daughter my father simply couldn't see. Victor Thorne is 61. He spent 4 years in the Army during the 1980s, serving stateside in support roles. He received an honorable discharge, nothing to be ashamed of, but nothing particularly remarkable. He returned from his service and spent the next 30 years crafting a persona for himself that was far grander than the service he'd actually performed. This wasn't in subtle ways, but in elaborate, detailed, consistently maintained narratives, tales of combat he'd never witnessed, missions he'd never been a part of, a record of heroism that existed entirely in his telling and nowhere in any official document. He was exceptionally good at it. People unfamiliar with military service often don't know its specific vocabulary, its institutional language, the way those who've been there describe their experiences. My father had mastered that vocabulary. He used it accurately. His stories contained the correct details in the right places. I know this because I grew up believing them. I also know they were false because Kaylin later uncovered the documents, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in a home where my father's military stories were the central narrative of our family identity. These were the anecdotes he shared at dinner parties, at his brother's backyard cookouts, at the Veterans Hall where he was a respected member and occasional speaker. He wore his discharge with the authority of a man whose service meant something profound, and people around him took him at his word, as you tend to do when someone recounts their own experiences. I enlisted at 18. I want to be very clear, I did not do this to impress him. The simpler version of this story, daughter enlists to earn absent father's approval, is not what happened. I enlisted because I'd wanted to fly since I was 9 years old, because the Army offered me a direct path to flight school, and because I am the type of person who, when she desires something, moves directly toward it rather than waiting for circumstances to align. My father's reaction when I told him was not pride. "You'll wash out," he declared. "Flight school isn't for people who haven't been through real training first." I had completed 4 years of ROTC. My fitness level, described by my PT instructor in the careful language of someone trying not to demoralize other candidates, was exceptional. I was 22 years old and had already proven to every institutional authority that evaluated me that I was not destined to wash out. And I didn't. I graduated flight school. I deployed. I returned. I deployed again. I built a record as a pilot who confronts difficult situations and excels in them, a simple enough concept to describe, but an extraordinarily challenging reality to live, day after day, in conditions that test every fiber of your being simultaneously. My father attended my commissioning. He positioned himself correctly, shook the appropriate hands, and accepted the compliments of my commanding officers with the practiced ease of a man comfortable in military settings, which, of course, he was, having performed comfort in such settings for 3 decades. He never once said he was proud of me. Not at my commissioning. Not after my first deployment. Not after my second. Not when the decorations arrived, awarded through official channels and documented in my service record, each one representing a specific act evaluated by professionals whose job it was to assess such things accurately. He always found other things to say. The medals were routine. The deployments were support roles. The commendations were political. He spoke these words without evidence, without documentation, without any basis other than the need to diminish my accomplishments to a size that fit beneath his own fabricated narrative. I stopped expecting otherwise around my 3rd deployment. That is not a solely sad sentence, or not only a sad sentence. There is a distinct liberation in letting go of an expectation you've pursued for years. The energy you had poured into that pursuit becomes available for other endeavors. I channeled it into flying, into my crew, into the work itself. I met Kaylin at Fort Campbell in 2017. He was visiting a colleague, a Navy man, a professional crossover that occurs when people operate in adjacent worlds. He was introduced to me at a squadron dinner as someone who knows what he's doing, which, in the specific social economy of the military, is a significant endorsement. We talked for 3 hours. He asked questions about flying that revealed he had genuinely thought about the craft, which is rarer than you might imagine. Kaylin Vance, now my husband, formerly Chief Petty Officer Kalen Vance, United States Navy, who served 11 years in special operations before medically separating due to an injury sustained during a training exercise that he casually describes as inconvenient, and that anyone who knows him describes as considerably more than inconvenient, is the most steadfast person I have ever known. Not in the passive sense of steadiness, not as someone who remains inert, but in the active sense, a steadfastness that is chosen, maintained, and deployed precisely at moments when the alternative would be easier. He proposed to me 11 months after we met, in the kitchen of my apartment in Clarksville, on a Tuesday evening while I was preparing pasta and he was reading a report at the counter. He didn't have a ring. He'd been planning to get one, he told me later. But then he was simply sitting there, reading, and I was cooking, and it felt like the right moment, and he wasn't a man who argued with right moments. I said yes before he finished the question. The question of my uniform arose 4 months before the wedding. I had been out of active service for a year by then, medically transitioned due to a knee injury, the cumulative effect of years in the aircraft seat and several impact incidents that my body had managed, until, at 32, it finally declined to manage any further. I was working as a civilian flight instructor and consulting part-time for a defense contractor. I wore my flight suits to work and civilian clothes everywhere else. The wedding dress had been purchased, a beautiful garment that I had tried on with Kalen's mother, Evelyn, in a Nashville boutique. I immediately understood it wasn't quite right. Not for aesthetic reasons, but because I kept thinking about the uniform hanging in my closet, and feeling as though I was wearing the wrong thing. I didn't voice this immediately. I pondered it for a week. Then I told Kalen. He set aside whatever he was reading and looked at me with the complete focus he reserves for matters he deems worthy of his full attention. "You want to wear your dress uniform," he stated. "I think so," I replied. I don't know if people will think it's, Elara," he interrupted, simply, not to cut me off, but to bring us back to what mattered. "You earned every piece of that uniform. Wear it proudly." So I wore it. My father called the week before the wedding. A routine call, logistics, arrival times, the name of the hotel where his side of the family was staying. At the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said, "I hear you're wearing your uniform." "Yes," I confirmed. A pause. "Is that necessary?" "It's my wedding," I said. "People will think you're trying to make a statement." "I'm not trying to make a statement. I'm wearing my uniform." Another pause. "Fine," he conceded. Not with acceptance, but with the specific tone of someone who has officially registered an objection and reserves the right to revisit it. And revisit it he did. The reception was held at the Caron Estate in Franklin, Tennessee. An antebellum property with a rich history that Kalen and I had chosen for its beautiful grounds, the exquisite late afternoon light, and because Evelyn had wept when she saw it, which we considered decisive. It was October, the kind of Tennessee fall afternoon that inspires songs. The ceremony had been everything we desired, intimate, meaningful, officiated by a Navy chaplain who had known Kalen for years and possessed the rare gift of speaking profound truths without sounding rehearsed. Kalen's family was warm and fully present. My mother sat in the front row, shedding tears with the generous, uncomplicated joy of someone genuinely happy. My father was there. He wore the dress shirt my mother had bought him. He sat through the ceremony with the contained posture of a man determined to be appropriate, which was the best version of him in public settings. The reception drifted into the golden hour. A string quartet played softly. Caterers circulated with trays of delicacies that Kalen and I both agreed were superior to the alternatives. Tables filled with people who loved us, in various interpretations of that word. Veterans approached me, not in a formal way, but with the subtle recognition that comes when they spot a uniform and wish to acknowledge the person wearing it. A retired Marine named Commander Arthur Sterling, 26 years of service, shook my hand at the bar and said, "Black Hawk?" "Yes, sir," I replied, and we shared 4 minutes of that unique conversation pilots have with other pilots. A retired Army sergeant named Marco Rodriguez, who had served in Afghanistan, thanked me with a sincerity that spoke of genuine appreciation, not mere performance. I watched my father observing these interactions from across the room. I had been watching him for an hour. The expression on his face had been darkening by degrees. Not dramatically, not in a way that the entire room could perceive, but in a way I had interpreted my entire life, with the precise understanding that comes from long exposure. Each handshake, each word of thanks, each moment of recognition from a veteran who understood what the uniform represented, each one deepened his darkening mood by another degree. I was speaking with Sergeant Rodriguez when I heard the music cease. I turned. My father stood 4 feet behind me. The string quartet, with the instinct of musicians who sense the atmosphere of a room for a living, had fallen silent. "Don't tell me," he began, "that you're actually wearing those things." 50 people turned. I have often reflected on the specific quality of that moment. The precise sensation of standing in a room full of people who love you, on the most significant day of your adult life, while your father's voice slices through the sudden silence toward you. It wasn't an entirely new feeling. It was a familiar sensation in an unfamiliar setting, which can sometimes be worse. "Dad," I said, my voice level. "Please don't do this today." "Oh, I'm doing this," he retorted. He stepped closer. His eyes fixed on my chest, on the medals pinned to my uniform. Each one representing a specific act, awarded through official military channels by individuals whose duty it was to award them correctly. "Those are attention-seeking decorations." His voice had risen, not shouting, but projecting, as someone does when they intend for an entire room to hear. "People have been congratulating you all afternoon like you're some kind of hero." I thought of the friends whose names grace memorial walls. I thought of the profound significance those medals represented, the aspects not described in the official citations because citations are institutional, and some truths transcend institutions. "Every medal on this uniform," I stated, "was awarded through official military channels." He snorted. "Sure they were." Commander Sterling, the retired Marine, had moved to my left. He regarded my father with the expression of a man who has decided not to intervene yet, but is perfectly positioned to do so. "Take them off," my father demanded. I stared at him. "What?" "The medals. Take them off." A sound rippled through the room. Not quite a gasp, more like a collective intake of breath that never fully released. The sound of 50 people processing an unbelievable event. I straightened my shoulders. That posture wasn't a conscious decision, it was the automatic stance of someone trained to stand a certain way, whose body inherently understands this is the moment for it. "No," I replied. His face turned crimson. "No. No, you're not removing them for exactly 1 second." I counted it without meaning to, the way trained pilots automatically count things. No one moved. Then his hand shot up. Crack. The pain arrived with a half-second delay, and my head had already snapped sideways by the time I felt it. I heard something small hit the floor twice before it went still, and I knew what it was before I looked. The gold hoop Evelyn had given me, lying near the chair leg. I turned back. My father's hand remained in the space where it had been. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. No longer just anger, exactly. Something beyond anger. Something anger morphs into when it has outrun the part of a person that governs it. His hand began to rise again. Kaylin's hand closed around his wrist. I need to tell you about Kaylin's 6 words, because those words are the heart of this story and require context to carry their full weight. She saved 12 men that day. Kaylin had never mentioned his intention to say them. He hadn't asked my permission. He hadn't discussed it. He had simply held my father's wrist in a grip that would not tighten and would not release. And he had looked directly into Victor Thorne's eyes, and he had spoken those 6 words with the calm certainty of someone who has chosen them meticulously and understands precisely what they mean to the person hearing them. What transpired on my father's face in the aftermath of those words requires me to explain 2 things. The first is the mission, Eastern Afghanistan, 2014. A day that began as a routine support flight and transformed into something else entirely within 14 minutes, when communications failed and the ground situation deteriorated faster than initial intelligence had indicated. 12 soldiers. Pinned down, outnumbered. The existing window for extraction was not the window that had been breached. The window that did exist demanded a decision that the flight manual did not specifically address, a decision I made in the time available, approximately 40 seconds. The official report, declassified 3 years later, credited our crew with a pivotal role in the extraction of those soldiers. The language of official reports is institutional and concise. It doesn't convey what 40 seconds of that particular kind of decision-making feels like. But the language is accurate, as far as it goes. My father knew nothing of this mission, because it had been classified, and because I didn't typically discuss such things, and because he had not, in 11 years of my service, ever asked me about my experiences in a way that suggested he wanted an authentic answer rather than confirmation of a narrative he already held. The second thing is what Kaylin discovered. He had proposed in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening while I was making pasta. In the months between that proposal and our wedding, he had done what he does with matters important to him. He had read everything. My service record, the commendations, the declassified report from 2014, which he had located through channels available to someone with his clearance history and his specific knowledge of how to find what has been made findable. He had also found my father's service record. Not through any improper means, discharge records become public information after a certain period, and my father's was public. Kaylin had looked at it because he looked at everything. What it revealed was honorable service, stateside support roles, an honorable discharge with no combat deployments. Nothing shameful, nothing that should have warranted a different account. But it was a profoundly different account from the one my father had been telling for 30 years. Kaylin had not shared his findings with me. He had categorized them as things I know that are relevant to understanding the situation, and had quietly carried that knowledge for months. When he held my father's wrist and spoke those 6 words, he was speaking to a man who understood precisely what the 2014 mission meant. Not because Kaylin explained it, but because Victor Thorne knew what classified records looked like, and knew what it signified when someone spoke about a classified event with the specificity of someone who had read the file. He understood that Kaylin had seen everything, both files. The color drained from his face. His knees gave way. He went down. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Kaylin had immediately dropped to his knees beside my father. No hesitation, no moment of satisfaction or withdrawal, just the direct movement toward a person in need, which is who Kaylin is when circumstances are stripped down to their bare essentials. My father regained consciousness before the paramedics reached him. He lay on the reception floor of the Karen estate, gazing up at the ceiling with an expression I lacked precise language for. Not fear. Not the fear that had crossed his face at Kaylin's words. Something beyond fear. Something that exists on the other side of a wall you've been constructing for 30 years, and have just watched crumble in a room full of witnesses. Commander Sterling knelt beside Kaylin. He had moved there without being asked, with the pragmatic efficiency of a man trained to move toward problems rather than away from them. He monitored my father's pulse with 2 fingers at his wrist, describing what he felt to the paramedic on the phone with the clinical precision of someone who had done this many times before. Detective Sergeant Naomi Ellis of the Williamson County Sheriff's Department arrived 12 minutes after the paramedics. She was 53, with 17 years on the force, possessing the specific economy of movement of someone who has responded to situations long enough that she has stopped performing authority and simply exercises it. She spoke to me on the estate's porch while the paramedics worked inside. She took a statement. She was professional and direct, asked clear questions, and gave me the space to answer them clearly. She asked if I wished to press charges. I had been considering this since the moment my father's hand connected. Not consciously, in the way trained individuals ponder decisions, which is less like active deliberation and more like a part of your mind running calculations alongside whatever else is happening. Yes, I confirmed. She nodded. She wrote it down. My friend and former fellow pilot, Captain Lena Petrova, 8 years Army aviation, now civilian, who had flown with me on my second deployment and was one of the people I most wanted at my wedding, had been standing near the door during the incident. She had footage on her phone. She handed it to Detective Ellis with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who understood its necessity. The footage was undeniably clear. It showed everything in sequence, from the moment my father approached me to the moment Kaylin's hand closed around his wrist, to the moment my father collapsed. Clear enough that the question of what happened had a complete visual answer that did not rely on anyone's testimony. My mother found me on the porch while Detective Ellis was still there. She looked at my face, my cheek, which had developed the distinct discoloration of something that had been struck and was now broadcasting the news. She covered her mouth with her hand and cried with the specific sound of someone who has known something was inevitable for a long time, had been hoping it wouldn't happen, and had just lost that hope. "Ilara," she murmured. "I know, Mom. I'm so sorry. I know." She wasn't apologizing for my father, not exactly. Or not only for my father. She was apologizing for the years of distance between what she had seen and what she had said, which is a larger apology and one that takes longer to work through than a single conversation on a porch. I held her hand for a while. Kaylin found us 20 minutes later. He stepped onto the porch and stood beside me, his gaze fixed on my cheek with the expression of a man cataloging damage and keeping his reaction to that cataloging internal, which is the professional version of what most people would call fury. "How are you?" he asked. "Standing," I replied. "That's enough," he said. We stood on the porch of the Karen estate in the last of the October light. He put his arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into him slightly, not something I typically do in public, and something I didn't examine at the time. But I've thought about it since, the specific permission of a day that has stripped everything down to its bare truth, which was that I was exhausted, and my cheek hurt, and the man beside me had caught my father's wrist, uttered 6 words, and then immediately knelt to help him. And I loved him for both of those things. My father was transported to Williamson Medical Center for evaluation. He had not suffered a cardiac event. The collapse had been vasovagal, the paramedic explained, the medical term for a fainting response triggered by acute emotional stress. He was conscious and stable and would be discharged the following morning. I did not go to the hospital that night. Kaylin and I remained at the estate until the last of our guests had departed. I was not going to allow my father to completely hijack the evening. And I believe most of the people who stayed understood this, because they stayed in the way people stay when they have decided to simply be present for someone, not noisily, but by their quiet presence. Commander Sterling shook my hand before he left. He held it for a moment longer than a typical handshake requires. "I've read about that day," he offered. "The 2014 extraction." I met his gaze. "Not all of it," he clarified. "The public version, after it was declassified." He paused. "I knew someone who was there." I nodded. "Your husband," he continued, "he knows what those medals mean." "He does," I confirmed. He released my hand. He nodded once, with the specific gravity of a man making an acknowledgement rather than a compliment. Then he departed. The charge of domestic assault was filed the following week. My attorney, Brenda Hayes, 21 years in family and civil law, a woman possessing the specific directness of someone who has encountered enough difficult facts in enough rooms to understand that clarity is more useful than comfort, guided me through the process with the same professional attention she gave everything. "The footage is complete," she informed me. "The witness statements are consistent. This is a strong case. I know, I replied. What outcome are you seeking? I considered that question, the specific range of available outcomes, what each would mean, and whether any truly provided what I was genuinely looking for, something I had been trying to articulate clearly since the wedding night. I want the record to exist, I finally said. I want there to be a document that states this happened. Brenda nodded. She understood. The case resulted in a misdemeanor charge, a fine, and a mandatory counseling requirement, which my father accepted without contest. His attorney, a colleague of Brenda's whom she described as competent and currently quite uncomfortable with his client's situation, had evidently advised him that contesting the footage would not yield a better outcome. My father did not contact me during this process, save for one letter. Handwritten, 3 pages, delivered through his attorney to mine. I will not reproduce it here, because some things deserve to remain between the individuals involved, even in a story that has demanded specificity about other matters. I will say that the letter contained, for the first time in 32 years, the word sorry, applied to me specifically and without qualification. I read it 3 times. I placed it in a drawer. I have not responded yet. That is not a permanent state, it is a current one. 6 months later. Kaylin and I live in a house in Clarksville that we purchased in February. It needs work in the back rooms, but it has a kitchen we both consider excellent and a back porch that faces east. I teach flight instruction 3 days a week. Kaylin consults. We make dinner. We argue about coffee, he drinks it with too much cream, a position I find indefensible, a position he cheerfully defends. My mother visits once a month. We have been navigating the honest version of our relationship, which is different from the comfortable version, and harder, and I think real in a way the comfortable version was not. She is doing that work because she has chosen to do it, which is the only way it can be done. My father and I have not spoken.